One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers.
Since the beginning of humanity, we have struggled to reach true equality. This fight has extended over centuries of our history. In the United States, it has been an especially hard struggle for the African American people. Slavery had disenfranchised millions, and even after their emancipation, they had not reached any semblance of equality. This change towards equality came slowly through many civil rights acts and amendments. From the right to freedom to the right to vote, we have gone through many stages in our progress towards equality. One of these great leaps is the decision of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka was a major step towards the dismantling of racial inequality and many other forms of disenfranchisement throughout the nation. Through much debate, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the establishment of separate schools for students of different races to be unconstitutional.
Beginning in the 1940s, racial tensions under the Separate but Equal Acts were at their highest. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had been working on challenging segregated schooling throughout the nation. Topeka was an ideal location to challenge segregation because in most other segregated states, any attempt to further equality was met with violence.
In South Carolina, they were actually chronologically the first court case organized by the NAACP to challenge segregation. So in that one, major inequities between the schools, and there too you have kind of the bigger response to challenging segregation in America. Here in Topeka, there wasn't that big of a response, except for a lot of community members worrying about what the effect of potentially ending segregation would be on teachers. But in South Carolina, everybody who signed on to be a plaintiff in that court case was retaliated against, and sometimes violently. So many of them, they were fired from their jobs. If they had farms, nobody would buy their crops or supplies. Or one person had a gas station and it was essentially shut down. The community organizer there was a minister who helped get the court case started. He was ran out of the state of South Carolina. His church was bombed.
The local NAACP chapter in Topeka was encouraging African Americans to enroll their children in all-white schools. Oliver Brown was one of these people. Oliver's request for his daughter to attend Sumner Elementary, an all-white school, was refused. His daughter, Linda, was forced to attend Monroe Elementary, far from home instead. Oliver Brown, with the help of the NAACP, filed a lawsuit against the school board. The lawsuit claimed that the educational facilities used by black schools were inferior, although its main argument was that segregated schools were unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. A district court heard the case and ruled against Brown, citing the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. The NAACP, not settling for this decision, appealed the case to the Supreme Court.
In 1952, this appeal was joined by 4 other cases from Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. The court combined these 4 cases presented under the Supreme Court with the heading Oliver L. Brown et al. Versus the Board of Education of Topeka et al. Mr. Brown was assigned as the lead plaintiff and was the namesake of the case. His name ended up being synonymous with the integration of schools. The case's goal was to decide whether the 14th Amendment allowed the segregation of schools. Thurgood Marshall, chief counsel for the NAACP, argued that separate schools for black and white students were inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. Marshall argued that segregation made blacks feel inferior to whites and thus not legally permissible.
Was the Clark Doll study. And with that study, you have 2 dolls that were being used, identical in every aspect with the exception of skin color. And they'd ask students really at the young age of about 5, 6, or 7 years old, questions like which doll is the nice doll, which doll is the pretty doll, which doll is the smart doll. The overwhelming majority of students would identify the white doll with all those positive aspects. And then they turn around and ask the opposite question. Well, which doll is the ugly doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the dumb doll? And they'd identify it with the black doll. And the last question they'd ask is, which doll is you? And so that's where students would either try to distance themselves from the doll, or they'd have to explain who the doll was and who they were, and sometimes using extremely derogatory terms to do that.
The case was heard in spring, but they took too long to come to a consensus, so it was decided to rehear the case come fall. In September, Chief Justice Fred Vinson had died and was replaced by Governor Earl Warren of California. Chief Justice Warren had previously supported the integration of Mexican-American students in California. Warren was able to bring the courts to a unanimous decision. On May 14, 1954, Chief Justice Warren delivered the opinion of the court, stating, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are, by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment."
The court was heard again starting on April 11, 1955, this time to decide the direction their decision would take. The court already came to a decision that segregated schools are unconstitutional. District schools and local authorities were ordered to take appropriate steps to integrate public schools with all deliberate speed. No time limit was set for this action to take place, and the court did not state any way for the decision to be enforced.
And that was kind of that escape valve that was designed to give the South some resistance to it. They didn't, I don't think, anticipate the massive resistance that happened as a result of it. I don't think they expected a lot of the Southern politicians and governors to come up with this massive resistance plan and strategy, the Southern Manifesto, as it kind of became known, to really gum up the works as much as it did. But that was kind of what ended up happening, is everybody just said, we're not going to comply with this Supreme Court decision. There's no way you can enforce it.
Many Southern states strongly advocated for segregation. The Arkansas Board of Directors themselves stated in 1955, "We think that the decision was erroneous. What it has said must stand until there is a correcting constitutional amendment or until the court corrects its own error." For them, the idea of integrated schools was too radical. Due to this, any actual progress towards integration was extremely slow. By 1964, nearly an entire decade after the case concluded, only about 1% of the black children in the South attended school with white students, and those who did were constantly harassed. A notable example of this were the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas. Despite this, many states, especially northern ones, did begin the slow conversion into integrated schooling. Some states had already begun this conversion to integrated schooling and welcomed Brown v. Board's decision with open arms, such as California with Mendez versus Westminster, 1946.
Despite the lack of any time limit or methods of enforcing this decision, the case still clearly decided that the idea of separate but equal facilities was unconstitutional. This set a legal precedent that could be referred to in future cases if necessary. This case helped to set the foundation on which the civil rights movement could be built. Some of the events following the case helped to spread awareness of the injustice that was still taking place in the South. This case was a landmark victory in the fight for equal rights and encouraged activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and many others to pressure lawmakers, courts, and society as a whole. Without Brown v. Board to encourage people like these, our country might have turned out to be a much more prejudiced place today.